What does the future hold for Red Bull, Williams and Cadillac? Why are drivers who impressed in 2025 struggling so much in 2026? And which team has laid the best foundations for a title shot in 2027? These are just some of the topics we'll be tackling in this special video where you guys have set the agenda with your questions. Plus, stick around to find out which driver we'd put in another team's 2026 car for one race only. Ed, let's get straight into it. I want to start off by talking about three teams we had questions about, each of which you might say is in some degree of turmoil right now. Red Bull, Williams and Cadillac. Let's go with Red Bull first. I know you've written about this recently for the race. So how do you see the next few years for that team? Can the new wind tunnel fix things, or are the problems there bigger and deeper rooted?
Yeah, I certainly don't think the trouble they're having is purely based upon the wind tunnel, but the new one will come online in 27. That will certainly help in terms of tools, but I don't think the problem with Red Bull is the tools or even the personnel overall. We're seeing one of two things with Red Bull right now. Either it's just a top team going through one of those little lulls, the fallow period, no team can stay on top every single year. There's peaks and troughs. So is this a trough that will then precede a return to the front, just as during the early years of the hybrid engines, Red Bull struggled? That would be the normal thing you would expect, but there's been a fundamental change in the nature of Red Bull, and the other possibility is we're seeing this newer, more corporate version of Red Bull in terms of the level of corporate oversight and control from Red Bull centrally, and Oliver Mintzlaff is the main guy there. Is there more of this? And is that taking away some of the edge that the team had? And this isn't about whether, say, someone like Laurent Mekies, who's the team principal, is capable of. He is not empowered to anything like the level of Christian Horner. So he is much more a sort of functionary and employee. And in fact, the fact that Horner was almost all powerful in Red Bull was one of the reasons that led to his removal, because there was this lengthy battle with the corporate side. And too much corporate oversight in F1 is a bad thing. You need there to be a basic level of corporate oversight for the way things are done. But fundamentally, you need to let an F1 team be an F1 team. That's what Dietrich Mateschitz, the co-founder of Red Bull, the guy who drove all of its motorsport investments, was brilliant at. He was interested and engaged, but he didn't really interfere except very occasionally, and used that political heft and might to get what they wanted in the paddock. And we have seen that this new Red Bull isn't necessarily operating at anything like the same level politically. The whole Aduo thing with the engine upgrades, I cannot believe the old Red Bull would find themselves in this position, given how much arguing there was about the process and the way things are measured. I have no doubt they wouldn't have found their V6 to be decreed to be the strongest engine, and therefore not be able to upgrade it. So we're seeing one of these two things. I must admit, I'm always very nervous about Formula One teams that have too much of that corporate oversight. They need to be nimble, sharp, reactive, do things the F1 way, because the lead times in F1 are super, super short. You cannot dither or run it like a larger organisation. So my concern is, and I'd probably come down slightly more in that direction, that we might be seeing a newer version of Red Bull that isn't as nimble or dynamic as what made Red Bull great previously. That doesn't mean you have to have Christian Horner back or anything. That's not what I'm saying. But that style of leadership and dynamism is what a Formula One team needs. It's got all the kit, it's got all the equipment, particularly once that wind tunnel's online. It's got great people, but has it got that extra X factor, or will it be held back by being seen as just another part of a wider corporate empire rather than a very specialised business unit?
Speaking of dynamic leadership, what do you make of the job Laurent Mekies has done? Because from the outside, it seems like he's presiding over a crumbling empire where people are fleeing for other teams. Is that just part of a natural transition, or does he have to hold some accountability for the fact that that team is changing so quickly?
I don't think fundamentally it's of his making. He's a very skilled guy, Laurent Mekies. He does feel very much like someone who's sort of contained. He's a bit in his box. He's not playing the public game anything like the way his predecessor did in terms of what he said. Now, you might not like the way Christian Horner did things, but he certainly had a strategy, and there was a PR strategy that he would work, both in terms of what he said on record and off record, how he worked behind the scenes, etc. I don't see Mekies doing that, but I don't see Mekies being empowered to do that. He's much more there to basically run the engineering side, the racetrack side operation, etc. He doesn't have that scope, and I think that's a danger. So I don't think it's his fault by any stretch of the imagination that there's been this kind of brain drain at Red Bull. And to an extent, you will always see this with teams that are great. You get people moving on. It's just what happens. And succession planning is the easiest thing to talk about, the hardest thing to execute. So for me, the key thing is that Red Bull need to decide how much leeway they give Laurent Mekies and the other decision makers at the top of that team to just do what they need to do. Because if you don't do that, and this is not just Red Bull, this is any team, you will struggle. So I think you need to let Mekies do things the way he wants and not feel like he's just there to serve the corporate side and the corporate leadership, etc. He needs to be given that leeway to succeed or fail on that basis rather than being boxed into a corner.
Let's move on to Williams now. Ed, what's your take on this question of James Vowles and how much pressure he's under now, given how poor Williams has been at the start of 2026 under his stewardship?
There's inevitably pressure. He had credit in the bank because Williams has made good progress. And the key thing is, are the changes behind the scenes being made? Are the fixes being made? And that will all be summed up in next year's car. Next year's car needs to be on time. It needs to be on weight. It needs to be at least a strong midfield performance. And I think if that happens, it will create stability. If they have more problems and they've not solved the underlying difficulties, then he's going to be in real trouble. You have to be really careful as a Formula One team about getting into a football manager mindset, because Williams was fantastically effective last year, overachieved, and then they underachieved this year. Now, one of the reasons last year was impressive was because of the focus of resources on this year. So the fact that they failed this year fundamentally is a bigger negative than the positive of last year. But it's never linear progress. There's so much that these teams who are not in the big teams have to do to catch up on 20 years of underinvestment and underspending. And it's not the work of a moment to catch up and close that gap. So let's see where they are at the start of next season. But I think the point where Doralton Capital, the ownership, might start asking questions is if things don't start on an even keel and well next year. That could be panic stations for Vowles' position, and they may reconsider it. But he's not turned from somebody who's being heavily praised into an idiot. You know, ultimately, exactly where he is on that scale, it is to be decided. But you can't just constantly look at an F1 team where it is in an instant and say, oh, they're rubbish, out they go, because every team has its struggles. It's never clear-cut and easy and straightforward.
I know you're a big fan of teams getting in front of problems, owning up to them, facing them, explaining what's going on. And Vowles is very comfortable in front of cameras and talking to the media. But there seems to be a kind of recurring theme in his explanations of the team goes through a massive dip, unexpected maybe, like this season, and then it's brushed off as we needed this. Actually, this bad thing is a good thing because we've learned lessons that we apply to the future. But then it happens again. We saw this in 24. We're seeing it again in 26. So what do you make of that? Do you think that's just Vowles putting a brave face on it, or does it lead you to question maybe his grasp of what that team can actually do?
Well, I'm fine with going through that process because, yes, you learn more when you're struggling than when things go well. And it's always going to be kind of a bit of a zigzag in terms of that progress. What concerns me is previously he's been very good at explaining what had gone wrong and very much upfront about it. He hasn't really done that this time. So that makes you wonder exactly what is at the root of the problem. Should he have been more on top of it? Is it part of a mindset of because this is kind of the realisation of his Williams? Is he being more cautious about it? Is there some concern about a partner or something that on the technical side that's caused them problems that they don't want to let the cat out the bag? So I always look for a team that's at ease with its struggles in terms of explaining, fronting up, saying, right, we did this, and this, we're trying to do this to fix it. I'm not seeing that from Williams currently, and that's my biggest single concern about what's gone wrong. Do they understand it? Are they willing to actually confront it? And therefore, are the changes behind the scenes that need to be made being made?
Let's finish this first section with a brief discussion about Cadillac, because they've been in the news during an otherwise quiet summer break, suddenly replacing founding team principal Graham Loudon with Marcin Budkowski. Obviously, you did an extensive video on that for the race with Josh Suttle, so we won't dwell on it too much. But we did have a question. I want to be honest about this in advance of that news breaking, just asking more generally, where do you see this team getting to over the next few years? But obviously taking account of the fact they're now going through this leadership transition.
it's going to be a long, hard climb. They've started from a higher level than anticipated, and I think they've done remarkably well. Yeah, they've got the brake problems, etc., but it's a really complicated area, and it just takes time to iterate through that. So they've got a good foundation. But remember, their UK Silverstone factory isn't in its final form yet. The US factory in Indianapolis isn't even finished yet. So this is a prototype team, effectively, by which I mean it's not in its final form. So it's going to take a very long time to get all those pieces of kit. And they've got a driver and loop simulator that's on its way to being installed and set up in the USA, but that won't be in use until next year. So it's catching up on all these long established teams, both in terms of their technology, in terms of their staff, and also just the sheer accumulation of knowledge and design history and all of those things. It takes a very long time. So I would expect in 2 or 3 years, I think Cadillac just need to put one step after another, just slowly try and consolidate themselves close to the midfield and then kind of slowly latch onto it. But in 3 years, they're not going to be winning races. If they think they're going to be doing that in 3 years, then they are vastly underestimating the problem. And the risk is you get into that problem with Red Bull, is there the more corporate side just being unrealistic. So if I was Cadillac, I'd be sat there thinking, right, well, you're looking like at a 10-year cycle, not a 2-3 year cycle. So I hope they just keep working, make the most of the technology they've got, keep improving, and just slowly make gains. But impatience, that is the thing that could derail that whole team. Do not be impatient, because why the hell should you be beating any of these teams that have been doing it for decades straight out of the box? Why should you be doing it in year 2 and year 3? I think they're in a great position in that regard, but they've got to keep seeing through the plan and not be unrealistic about what can be achieved. Because if you underestimate the challenge in Formula One, you will be chewed up and spat out before you even know what happens.
Now, inevitably, we got some questions about the driver market, although I think it's fair to say that's not as dynamic or as interesting as it's been at times in recent seasons. The questions we got were focused on 2 teams, Red Bull and Haas. Let's start with Haas, and 2 relatively simple questions there. If Toyota wants a Japanese driver, who should they pick, and what happens to Esteban Ocon at the end of this season?
Well, I don't think Toyota wants a Japanese driver so much as they want a Toyota driver who will be a Japanese driver, if you see what I mean. So yeah. Ryo Hirakawa, who's 32, would be the obvious choice in that regard. Yuki Tsunoda was of interest to the team in the past, but from my understanding, he's not a super strong contender for that seat next year. And I don't think there's any kind of move to, we have to have a Japanese driver. I think quite a clever game is being played at Haas. I think there's a good chance Ocon will be replaced. They have got an option on him for next year, and obviously Hungary, his performance improved with the floor upgrade. But I think they are looking at all possibilities in terms of what's the best available, what's the possible financial advantage, because they're building this relationship with Toyota. They're trying to move more of the manufacturing, etc., to Toyota Motorsport in Cologne, get Toyota more and more invested. And there could be a very, very good both financial motivation for putting Hirakawa in the car, as well as that technical side and building up those relationships. And Hirakawa has been pretty good in the car. I don't think he's a future world champion, and obviously he's unusual age profile for a driver who would be making his F1 debut. But I think if they go down the Japanese route, then it will be Hirakawa, because he's basically the incumbent. He's built up a lot of experience, and he's a brisk driver who I don't think would let the team down. But I think right now, Haas's position is, well, we're just going to hold fire, see what happens. You never know what drivers might come up. What's the best balance of driver to potential in terms of what resources you can get in attached to it, etc. And I think that's quite a nice position for them to be in. And even if they have to keep Ocon, this has been a poor season for Ocon, but he's a good Formula One driver, isn't he? So what a position that is to be in, because they've got this list of drivers, and obviously Leo Fornaroli, the McLaren contracted F2 champion, was mightily impressive when he did that TPC test for Haas. Really, really impressive. And if they want him, there's, as I understand it, an agreement in place that they can take him on a loan. So it's almost an embarrassment of riches for Haas, which is great for a team that's struggling, because they've got Behrman, and they'll have Behrman next year. And there are multiple options in the other car who would do a good job. And Hirakawa, I think if it is a Japanese driver, it's going to be him. And I think he would do a very decent, competent Formula One driver job. He's not going to be the best driver on the grid, but he's absolutely not going to be the worst either if they do choose him.
If you had to pick one of those embarrassment of riches, which way are you leaning? Who do you think is the sort of number one contender, if you like?
I think I might lean towards Fornaroli, actually, which is a bit of a change of position. I'd be really interested to see Hirakawa. But Fornaroli, I've heard really positive things from both McLaren and Haas about what he can do. And there's always that interest in seeing young drivers. But at the same time, to bring back in a name who doesn't seem to be in a great shout, I would look at Tsunoda as well. If I was any of those teams in the midfield, I would look at Tsunoda as a possible option, because I don't think we've seen the absolute best of him in Formula One, and he's got good experience. But yeah, I'm going to go for Fornaroli personally, because there seems to be a bit of something there.
Yeah, nice choice. I'd pick Fornaroli too. It's nice to see the young talents that you haven't properly discovered yet get a shot, rather than some of the older drivers or drivers that you know a bit about. Inevitable Max Verstappen driver market question now, Ed. But the twist in this one is it's more about who might replace him if he were to exercise that option in his current contract and leave. So is Liam Lawson now the leading contender there? And could we see a Lawson-Hadjar lineup at the main Red Bull team?
I'd be very surprised, because Red Bull is a top championship chasing Formula One team, even though they're not chasing a championship right now, and they want a superstar driver. Liam Lawson has had a good season, but I don't think he's one of the best half dozen drivers in Formula One. He just isn't. I think he's a very good Grand Prix driver, and I think we're starting to see now he's got some stability, and this is the first season he's had that's proper, in that it's both a full season and he hasn't been ridiculously booted out of a team after 2 races. So we are starting to see what he can do, and I've been sort of impressed, but I wouldn't be looking at him as a top team. I don't know exactly where Red Bull's mindset is, but historically they've been a don't go back team. I know they've gone back with the second team, but Red Bull Racing, once you've had a driver through there and you've said, no, this isn't the driver, there was never a chance of Gasly going back in as a race driver. There was never a chance of Albon really going back in as a race driver, although after he'd gone to Williams, there was a little bit of interest. Again, I mean, going directly back in. So I think they will have to look elsewhere. So it then becomes, which of the established star drivers, race-winning drivers, can you get hold of? And actually, I think Carlos Sainz would be a good option, because let's say Max Verstappen were to tell Red Bull tomorrow that he wasn't racing for them next year. Sainz is the one that I think you can go to. I think that, I don't know exactly what it is, but my understanding is there's something in the contract in terms of performance and results that means he will be free at a certain date to trigger an escape if he wants to. So Sainz would be a great option for them. Again, I don't think he's the absolute best driver in F1, but I do think he's probably one of the best half dozen drivers in F1. And so Sainz is one possibility. And then you look at the others, you look at the Piastris. Can you get Piastri? Can you get Norris? Can you get Charles Leclerc? You would want to make sure you have an idea of if any of those would be interested. But I don't think Red Bull's the most appealing place. So Sainz seems obvious to me.
Yeah, I think Sainz is definitely one contender, knowing that he's got the top team chops from the past. I think probably they'd look at either a Piastri type. Norris, I feel like McLaren would do everything in their power to keep, especially given that he won the World Championship last year, is driving brilliantly this year. Piastri feels like the one of those two they'd be more prepared to let go. But Red Bull, they seem always very reluctant to go into the external market, and it's almost a last resort for them. So I feel like really they're banking on Lindblad, aren't they? Lindblad is there being benchmarked against Lawson. Lawson's role, although he's having a good season, is to benchmark Lindblad. And if Lindblad has a good enough season alongside him, then you look at his trajectory and go, well, he's our guy. So I think their plan A would be to put Lindblad in if they could. And then if not, they're going to go into the market and get a Piastri type or a Sainz type, like you said.
Realistically, for Red Bull, I think priority 1 is keep Verstappen. Priority 2 is keep Verstappen. And priority 3 is we cannot lose Verstappen. I really think that will be the mindset that they've got. And I think they're probably going to get their wish for next year, I think. Could change. I'd be a bit more worried about 28, though. That seems like the all bets are off year.
It will probably come as no surprise, given how divisive the 2026 regulations have been, that we got loads of questions about the nature of the formula. But I want to focus on a specific aspect of this that first really surfaced at the Belgian Grand Prix. It's this question of self-learning algorithms that control how the power units harvest and deploy their energy. So Ed, how do they work? Why do we need them? And to what extent is artificial intelligence involved in their operation?
Yeah, artificial intelligence is a dangerous phrase in that it's such a profoundly broad church. And if you take artificial intelligence as what it sounds like, it often oversells things a lot, because you start to think about something that's genuinely self-aware or self-learning, that kind of thing. Actually, these are self-learning, but it's not intelligence in that regard. So we're in the realms of the narrower world of artificial intelligence. It's not a neural network or anything. In terms of answering how it does it, it's actually extremely difficult. I can't do that, and I say that with no shame whatsoever, because I've asked, I've been there when, heads of the engine departments at teams have been asked about how these things all work, and they'll basically universally, the response is kind of this, and one said, there's basically a book about that thick. And there's a few control systems engineers or whatever, or specialists in it, who understand everything and how it all works. And that's how detailed it is. So the way it works, it's distance-based, and it is self-learning. So it is effectively, think of it as it's learning what is happening on a given lap, and it's adapting based upon that. So that's one of the reasons why consistent replication of laps is actually quite useful. So you also want to make sure you're doing the same distance, because there can be a bit of variation if you take a slightly different line or a few little mistakes. That can add distance to the lap, which causes a little bit of confusion as well. So it's basically trying to work out the optimum performance you will get from it. And most of the heavy lifting actually is done not kind of on the hoof from reacting and learning, but this is all it's all sort of a narrow system that's been programmed and the parameters are set, but it will react to the way the driver's driving, because there's loads of variables. Track conditions, wind can make a huge difference as well. Throttle application, do you have a little moment? All of these sorts of things. So it's just all about trying to maximise the harvesting and deployment over the course of a lap. And it's necessary, because the complexities of it, as they've said, it's really complicated if you were to put it completely into the hands of drivers. But it's just a way to get around the fact that fundamentally the level of electrical energy you need is far short of what you've actually got or are able to get. So it's kind of a means of papering over the cracks. But it does mean that drivers feel like there's an element of randomness, because 1 minute, particularly later in the lap, if there's a long straight late in the lap, and this was really clear in China early on, you get onto that back straight and suddenly you're losing 0.3, and you don't really know why. And it might be, that's where the Leclerc stuff with that little lift if you go to below 98% throttle, it delays, and there's all these things, power limited modes, a vast network of things that dictate this. So it's just really, really complicated. But fundamentally, it means that a driver can do a lap where they feel like they're fundamentally doing the same things, and the differences are in the noise of kind of nothing is directly 100% repeatable. There's always a little bit of variation, and then you get a completely different outcome, or you get a headwind and that changes it completely, and that costs you. And all of these things can make a performance swing of multiple tenths in a lap. So I think the thing to think of with artificial intelligence, in that, yes, it is self-learning, it is reacting, it is optimizing, but it's not reinventing the wheel. It is within certain set parameters that you can set, and teams will have regular updates kind of after each session to what's being done. But you can't do anything remotely from the pit wall or anything, and that's why it becomes an AI kind of thing, insofar as you've got a set of parameters and you want it to be adaptive. So it's not just doing exactly to the letter what you tell it on a given lap, because a given lap is not the same as the next given lap. And that's where there is a form of artificial intelligence involved. But I think, speaking in the wider world, artificial intelligence now is at a level of ubiquity and use that whenever artificial intelligence as a phrase is used, it can be used accurately, but it can be so vague as to mean nothing, because you then got to go down to the next level. What exactly is it doing? Is it a large language model? Is it a neural network? Is it, all of these things? Is it narrow?
Taking over, Ed? That's what it's doing.
Is it Skynet from Terminator 2? That kind of thing. So very, very... it's eye-catching, the artificial intelligence phrase, but you've always got to, with anything, try and delve down into what it's actually doing and what it actually means.
Okay, let's move on to another aspect of the rules that we had several questions about, this thing of yo-yo racing, which we've seen as a result of these battery-dominated power units in 2026. You've mentioned before, Ed, that these rules have produced some upsides too, particularly around the improved ability of the cars to follow each other more closely in battle. We had several questions, as I mentioned, about this yo-yo racing and whether this style of racing will remain when the fuel and electrical energy limits are adjusted for 2027 and 2028. What do you think?
I think it should reduce, certainly. I think there is a benefit of these rules in that it's shown that a good way to overpower the following problem is literally to overpower it with a bit of extra power or whatever for the car behind to stay close, and then you can make moves, etc. So
not just a bit, a massive amount.
Well, a massive
that's
amount,
the thing,
yeah,
isn't it?
So there is an interesting lesson in there, but it doesn't just necessarily mean you have to have a straightforward push to pass or whatever. But it will reduce because as time goes on, the dependence on the electric motor will reduce a little bit. They're moving it away from the notional 50-50. It was never quite 50-50. So I think 47-53 is the number the FI likes to put on it, 53% in favour of the V6. So we will see that reduced a little bit. So it's going to be one of the... And so I never had as big a problem with the yo-yo racing as the impact on, say, qualifying, etc., and the way the drivers drive. What I had a problem with is when overtakes, when you've got hundreds of brake horsepower more than your rival, being celebrated as a great overtake, because they're not. They can still be interesting in terms of trading positions and how they play out over a sequence of laps. I don't hate that, and I'm not saying you want it to be processional or anything, but I think also F1 hasn't helped itself, because a lot of F1's communication with the fans, etc., it's not really, it's marketing basically. It's just bludgeoningly telling people everything you're seeing is brilliant, and then you get pushback from it. So I think, to come back to what the question that was actually asked, I think you will see a reduction in that yo-yo racing effect, and maybe it'll hit a sweet spot where overtaking and battling is possible, but it's not so desperately easy. Perhaps, I'm not entirely sure. We will get to that, but we will see as these engines mature and change, and the parameters of the regs change, you will see just a gradual reduction in the power of the yo-yo racing.
Moving on to struggling drivers now, Ed. One thing this rule set has done is upend the competitive order, both among the teams and within them. And we had a couple of questions asking why drivers who compared better to their teammates in 2025 are less impressive this season. Is that a pattern you've noticed as well? And why are the likes of Leclerc, Russell and Piastri especially enjoying less competitive seasons relative to their teammates in 2026?
Yeah, there is a pattern there, and it's clear that there is a driving style that works well with these particular power units, in particularly in these cars. And I think it's important to remember there's been quite a big reduction in downforce as well. And one of the things that means is you have to live with the car moving around a little bit more. They tend to be called microslides. So this is sort of really small, as the name suggests, really small slides that require kind of the driver's attention, but they're not kind of big, huge moments. But you need to be able to handle a car that wants to do that, and not just have that kind of set the car up, chuck it in and sort of power through the corner, if you like to put it in a very, very simple way. And a lot of the drivers who've been struggling are the drivers who have historically struggled with that. Russell, Piastri and Leclerc, if you take Mexico as a good example, and Mexico is high altitude, so you've got reduced downforce thanks to the reduced air density. So even though you put loads and loads and loads of wing on and everything, you kind of have Monza or sub-Monza levels of downforce because the air density is lower. And Piastri struggled there. Russell has tended to struggle a bit more by his own admission with those. Leclerc as well, I remember in 2024 when Sainz outperformed him, he said, yeah, tracks like this I do struggle with a little bit. And it's not about being afraid of the car moving around or anything. It's about just kind of being able to dance on that really fine edge where it's moving a little bit and you're on top of it, and not going too far, but you're not sort of sitting within what the car can do because you want it to be feeling completely planted. And Antonelli's always been really, really good at this. Carlos Sainz has been good at this, and he's been very good under these regulations, just under the radar. So we're seeing those drivers tend to thrive, and we're seeing a driving style that's, because of how significant the power units and the deployment, the harvesting is in terms of your lap time, and you can lose 2-3 tenths just like that. There seem to be certain styles that work better with that, and it part of that is living with those microslides a little bit more. It's not quite chucking it into the corner and sorting it out. That's oversimplifying it. It's not that. But sometimes just kind of introducing the car to the corner a tiny bit early, playing with it a tiny bit more, seems to work pretty well. And you want to keep the turbo speed up as well. And one thing Antonelli's been great is having a driving style that's minimised what's called infill, which is when you have to use the electric motor to kind of make up for any shortfall in the V6 on corner exit, because that can make a huge difference, because the difference of a few percent in the battery state of charge can be absolutely massive, and certain drivers have adapted very, very well to this. There's an interesting Charles Leclerc quote when he says, well, yeah, to be a fast driver, you have to adapt. But he says, yeah, it adds more unpredictability to these cars. And I think pushing the absolute limit is probably less rewarding than it was in the past, because whenever you go over, whenever you have wheel spin, you waste energy on a wheel spin because you're not going forward and you're using the battery. And these things are making it less raw and a bit more of a thinking game and restraining yourself from going to the absolute limit. But it also means, this is me talking, not Leclerc anymore, that if you are a driver whose limit is based upon being sort of that really planted, and there's different ways to skin a cat, that can work really well under other rules, work really well in the ground effect era, for example. You might have to kind of sit a bit back from what you feel is the limit, whereas the drivers who kind of dance with the microslides, the Lando Norrises, for example, that tiny bit more can actually get a compound benefit from it. So I think that's roughly what we're seeing, and it's really difficult to adapt. It's difficult to reprogram yourself fundamentally to almost be a completely different driver, but that's what you have to do. That is the challenge, and I think we'll see that process of adaptation improving, and those drivers who are struggling making gains. But certainly, yeah, I mean, Leclerc, Piastri, and Russell are the three very, very clear examples, and that's not to take anything away from what the other guys, their teammates, are doing, because it's not their fault that their style to an extent gels with it. But equally, I asked Kimi Antonelli about this in Hungary, and he said, well, because I asked him, well, how much of it is, do you just think you are well suited driving style wise, and how much of it is adapting and work? And he said, well, actually, I think this is all based on the simulator work I was doing a year ago in terms of adapting. So they've also adapted well, identified the problem. And in the case of Antonelli and Russell, they both had the same simulator opportunities to do that. And even if Antonelli was having to adapt a bit less, he's still done it better. So none of these things are excuses. It's the driver's job to adapt. And Charles Leclerc has said that as well. So it's not a get out of jail free card. These cars aren't wrong, and other types of F1 cars are not right. You don't hear Max Verstappen. Well, you hear Max Verstappen complaining about the nature of the driving, but he's still very, very quick. You don't hear him complaining about that side of things in terms of the adapting. Yeah, he doesn't want the sort of the artificial seeding, as we tend to call it, of an understeery car. That will mean he can't unlock the pace he can from one with a bit more rear instability, but that's just putting a limit on the car for him. But adapting, he will still be at the limit of what that understeering car can be. It's just it'll be a bit more contained and might allow a teammate to get much more close to him. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out over the second half of the season and into next year, both as drivers adapt and the power units evolve and change as well. But what I would say is those drivers who are struggling, don't fall for the, write them off, they're washed, they were never any good, they've been found out narrative. It's not that simple. You have to judge drivers over a broad period. And all those drivers have got a lot of credit in the bank. And all of them have done some really good stuff this year. Piastri could have won at Suzuka. He was unlucky with the safety car. George Russell's won a couple of races. Charles Leclerc has won races and has had some... I mean, he actually started the season really well as well. So... you know, they're not incompetent idiots, and it's really fine details that are causing that swing against them. And there are times when it swings back, and there comes a point where it clicks and the pendulum swings, and it's maybe more in the middle, or maybe even you get back on top of your teammate. Who knows?
And a fun follow-up to this, Ed, if you could put any driver in another team's car for one race and one race only, which combination would you choose, and what do you think we'd learn?
I think I just always like putting Max Verstappen into different cars to learn, as much as anything, to learn about the cars. I think that's a slightly more academic interest in terms of what it'll show me, perhaps. And so it'd be, I mean, the classic one is, what would Verstappen do in a Racing Bulls, for example, in the junior team car? That's always an interesting one. But pretty much any car, what would Verstappen do in a McLaren? What would Verstappen do in a Ferrari? But let's throw just Verstappen right now into a Mercedes, because I'd love to see how he compares to Kimi Antonelli. Sorry, George Russell, but Antonelli's the gold standard at Mercedes at the moment. So where's their relative level? I'd be interested in seeing that. What could Verstappen get another tenth or two out of the Mercedes? You kind of think probably not, but actually he's very, very good at extracting that last little bit of pace. Could he allow the car to be made a tiny bit trickier and get a little bit more speed out of it? So yeah, for me, it's just throw Verstappen into different cars. I want him just to cycle through all of them and get a kind of benchmark. But even that never really works, because it's not just what the car can do, but drivers tailor the car to their preferences and what works best for them. And in Verstappen's case, he unlocks a higher ceiling of performance than a lot of other drivers can do because of his rear end instability tolerance, which not many drivers can match, it's fair to say.
That's a really nice pick. Yeah, I think it would be good to see the original Verstappen against the version of Verstappen Mercedes now thinks it has, and you could just see, well, which one of them's better. All things being equal, of course, we'd have to have a bit of leeway to say, well, he's embedded properly in the team, he's got enough set-up time and whatnot to make it a fair fight. I'm going to go with a completely different approach. I would put Nico Hülkenberg in that George Russell Mercedes. Sorry, George Russell again. Only because he's one of the few guys left on the grid who we've never seen in a top team. And so even though we might have an idea about his ceiling as a driver, it would be good to find out. He's been a super sub, of course, in the past as well. So he's used to being dropped in at short notice. I'd like to see how he gets on in a proper title contending front running car.
Yeah, I think it'd be fascinating to see that, and I'd like to see him throw him into a front-running car and put him on slicks on a slightly damp track,
yes.
And see him potentially blow everyone away. Because Hülkenberg, at his best, is still outstandingly good. He has his weaknesses. He's not kind of someone who's going to give you a full season of the absolute maximum every weekend, and
he doesn't need to, because it's one race.
Exactly, yeah. So if you get him in the right car at the right time, you could see something absolutely sensational from him. But actually the same could be said for a lot of drivers. But Hülkenberg, you're right, we haven't seen him in that scenario. So yeah, from that perspective, from a driver perspective, that would be really a good test to do. This is why we need more parallel universes in which we can run these F1 based experiments. I can't think of a better use for access to parallel universes than that.
Let's finish on the battle at the very front of the grid, Ed. 2 questions here. Does Ferrari still have a realistic shot at either championship in 2026? And which team is looking in the best shape to mount a challenge next season or the year after?
I would say Ferrari, mathematically it has a realistic chance, but it needs a proper step with its car. I think if the performance profile that we saw in the few races before the break continues, I don't think there's quite enough in that. I just don't think there's enough in that Ferrari. But a big upgrade could change everything. As for next year, I think the team I'm really interested in is McLaren, because they took the hit of being the customer team up against the works team, and they've worked through that. They got to the point where they could win in Hungary. And the question I'd like to know is Mercedes kind of asserting itself as the works team for good, or actually is it a temporary thing and McLaren is still underlying the stronger team and can get back on top? So for next year, it would be McLaren that is the one that interests me, and I think they're the one who's most likely to take that step to be a title winner again next year.